In 1942, as the United States entered World War II, the Manhattan Project was created with the mission of developing atomic bombs. The Hanford nuclear site in eastern Washington was one of 3 locations designated for this project. Specifically, it was the site that produced plutonium for the Fat Man bomb. While the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ultimately signaled an end to World War II, this was not the end of Hanford's military contributions. The Cold War began shortly after the bombings of Japan, which strained the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. Tensions rose as an increasing need to fill both countries' nuclear arsenals escalated into an all-out arms race. This international conflict created a need to secretly gain information on the Soviet Union's atomic weapons program. This was the focus of Hanford's Green Run experiment in 1949. The Hanford Green Run experiment created a clash between the U.S. government's responsibility to protect its citizens from a nuclear attack, the right of citizens to consent to their involvement in potentially harmful experiments, and the responsibility of the U.S. government to provide an appropriate response for those citizens who were potentially harmed by their involvement. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, known as Jo-1, on August 29, 1949. The United States quickly learned that they could detect nuclear testing from across the world when Jack Healy of the General Electric Health Instruments Division noticed abnormal radiation readings on an air filter located on Rattlesnake Mountain, close to the Hanford site in Washington. These filters were originally set up to test how radioactive contamination varied with altitude, but when these abnormal readings emerged in the known Soviet testing, Hanford scientists quickly realized that they could use this detection ability to spy on Soviet nuclear activity. This was a significant scientific breakthrough. It meant that the U.S. could develop a safe means to monitor the Soviet nuclear weapons program, empowering them to obtain more information to subvert hostile plans involving nuclear weapons directed at the United States. Because of this breakthrough, the Green Run experiment was quickly organized with the end goal of using aircraft to fly above test sites to measure and detect nuclear fallout. Conducted on December 2, 1949, as a collaboration between the Atomic Energy Commission and the United States Air Force, the Green Run was considered a part of the newly developed Air Force Long-Range Detection Program. The experiment was carefully organized to replicate the fallout from a Soviet nuclear weapons test. At Hanford, uranium was cooled for at least 90 days before being processed to create plutonium. This cooling period was necessary to allow reaction products to decay, minimizing environmental releases to the public. The main radioactive reaction product was iodine-131. With an 8-day half-life, this isotope was reduced to a very small fraction of the radioactivity that was found in pre-cooled uranium. In the Soviet Union, this process was shortened to 16 days, releasing more iodine-131 among other toxic materials. This shortening of the cooling period resulted in the experiment being dubbed the Green Run. The fuel was still fresh, not being aged to reduce emissions. Any remaining iodine-131 was typically caught in the filters located in Hanford smokestacks. These filters were disabled in order to release enough radioactivity to run the experiment, leaving people across Washington, Oregon, and Idaho vulnerable to potentially dangerous doses of radioactive iodine. It was clear that Hanford officials knew the potential danger to the public with the release, based on the fact that the filters were removed to allow iodine-131 into the atmosphere. Ideal weather conditions were identified by the Health Information Division of General Electric, a Hanford contractor, to control the movement of fallout and minimize the risk to Hanford's employees as well as surrounding citizens. The experiment was conducted in December 1949 because weather conditions were ideal at Hanford, with the most optimal precipitation and wind speeds. Releasing the radioactive material at night also allowed it to decay, in hopes of decreasing the exposure to citizens. Of course, no experiment is perfect, and with such volatile factors like the weather, something was bound to go wrong. The release of iodine-131 lasted 12 hours, as planned, but the wind caused radioactive fallout to spread all over the Pacific Northwest, causing scientists to lose track of the release. A 200 by 40 mile plume was released from Hanford smokestacks, with roughly 8,000 curies of radioactive iodine being released in the duration of the experiment. Around half that amount was planned to be released, but because the cold December weather froze some of the measurement equipment, inaccurate readings were made, misleading Hanford scientists on the actual amount of radioactivity released into the environment. After the release, men armed with Geiger counters were dispatched to determine the amount and spread of the fallout. They found that vegetation contamination readings in Kennewick showed to be 600 times the tolerable amount, and rain caused significant fallout to contaminate vegetation in Walla Walla Ocala, and Spokane. Iodine-131 spread on vegetation as far north as Kettle Falls, Washington, and as far south as Klamath Falls, Oregon. Additionally, the vegetation contamination at the Hanford site itself was so high that workers were setting off radiation monitors with their shoes. It's with no doubt that the Green Run is considered the single largest release of radiation in the Northwest United States. While some precautions were taken to protect the citizens surrounding Hanford, they were nevertheless put at risk by the Hanford Green Run experiment. Due to the infancy of nuclear science, Hanford scientists knew only that radiation was likely not good for humans, and they did not yet understand the complete effects of radiation exposure. Due to this lack of knowledge, it's important to understand that the health of surrounding citizens was not knowingly put in jeopardy to the same extent that it would be in hindsight. Additionally, it would have been impossible for citizens to consent to their exposure due to the secret nature of the experiment. Hanford officials knew there was a risk in exposing a population to iodine-131, but proceeded for the sake of national security and weapons development, ultimately endangering lives. It's important to note that residents of the area surrounding Hanford had been accidentally exposed to radioactive materials in the early days of Hanford, with doses much higher than those of the Green Run, before scientists perfected their filtration system. What makes the Green Run release different is that the choice to expose the public to radioactive substances was intentional and experimental, and was a failure in the government's responsibility to ensure public safety. Years after the experiment, the Green Run reports, along with other documents that detail the public's radiation exposure, were declassified and made available to the public under the Freedom of Information Act in 1989. When the citizens near the Hanford site learned about what they had been exposed to, they were furious. Because of Hanford's long-held reputation for safety, they felt betrayed. Many put two and two together, realizing the effects that their exposure to radiation might have had on their lives. People in the community who feared they were exposed wrote letters to those researching the effects of Hanford releases, detailing their surprising hardships. Gertrude Carter Hansen noticed that many of her high school classmates were dying in their early 50s, many of whom had cancer. Marked by grief, she took it upon herself to survey these classmates to aid researchers. Connie Schrum vulnerably noted that,
"All three of us have had our thyroids removed due to those exposures. I might also add that I also aborted a mutated fetus in 1957.
These extensive and diverse individual tragedies understandably caused many downwinders to sue. Most downwinders wanted an apology from the government and assistance with paying medical bills relating to their health issues that may have been linked to Hanford. In the words of Carlinda Parker, as written as a part of a letter to Representative Mary Lou Blazek of the Oregon Department of Energy,
I sincerely hope we can get recognition on this matter and free medical care soon. Please don't let our government abandon us."
However, downwinders like Miss Parker ran into a problem. The Hanford Dose Reconstruction Project began in 1988. The goal was to create a computerized reconstruction of the dose that nearby communities were exposed to during Hanford's years of operation. The study was an insurmountable task. Releases were being reconstructed on an hourly basis across a period of nearly 40 years. This project was completed in a commendable amount of time, and the reconstruction data was handed off to the Hanford Thyroid Disease Study so that they could work to better understand the health effects of prolonged radiation exposure.
What we did was we looked at the emissions over time. We simulated their transport through the atmosphere. We actually had records going back into the 40s from the Hanford Meteorological Station and others on an hourly basis. With the Hanford Thyroid Disease Study, there were probably not enough people living in this area at the right age and the right time to really see the signal.
Because of this, the study had inconclusive results, leaving downwinders with no evidence to support their medical hardships in court. They could not prove that their illnesses were caused by Hanford releases instead of genetics. Many of these downwinders received responses from legal offices like this one.
"This is to inform you that the administrative tort claim which you filed is denied. The reason for the denial is that the United States government is immune from liability for injury, death, or damage to property which may result from the exercise or performance of a discretionary function or duty."
However, this does not change the fact that the government took a huge risk on the lives of these people. At the very least, an apology should have been made. As of the date of this documentary, compensation has been awarded to only 2 downwinders, and no public apology has been made. The fault in the government's failure to fulfill their responsibility to keep its citizens safe is not dependent on whether these downwinders got sick, but rather in the conscious, intentional risk that they took on these citizens' health and safety. Ultimately, the hardships of these Green Run downwinders are an unfortunate consequence of an experiment deemed necessary necessary for the greater good. In times of international turmoil, rights and responsibilities can become convoluted and unclear. The Green Run is a prime example of this. The experiment created a clash between the U.S. government's responsibility to protect its citizens from the threat of nuclear warfare, the right of the public to consent to their involvement in experiments of unknown consequences, and the responsibility of the U.S. government to provide an adequate response for these unwillingly involved citizens. That is why understanding stories like these are so important, so we can learn to be more careful of our decisions and reconcile our past by taking accountability to build a better future.